Today, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome my dear friend and thought partner, Dr. Frances Vavrus, back to her alma mater. She works in the Comparative and International Development Education Program, Department of Organization and Leadership at University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. Situated in the field of comparative and international education and development studies, and drawing on the disciplines of anthropology and history, her research explores how schooling is promoted as a solution to a host of complex social problems in sub-Saharan Africa. Her cultural and political economic analyses question these prescriptions of education as panacea, which you can read about in her book, Desire and Decline, Schooling Amid Crisis in Tanzania. Professor Vavrus uses ethnographic techniques to explore how people make sense of educational development narratives that emerge from local, national, and international interactions. She also uses critical discourse analysis and survey methods to address, respectively, questions regarding poverty reduction policies and the long-term impact of secondary schooling on the lives of African youth. Her longitudinal ethnographic and survey research focuses on the Kilimanjaro region of northern Tanzania, where she has intermittently lived, taught, and studied since 1992. She's been involved in a teacher education program for Tanzanian secondary school teachers and teacher educators at Mwenge Catholic University in Moshi, Tanzania for years, and the results of her collaborative work with colleagues there can be found in the volume Teaching Intention, International Pedagogies, National Policies, and Teachers' Practices in Tanzania. I had the distinct pleasure of working with Dr. Vavrus and several graduate students to develop new approaches to comparative case studies, which are represented in the book, Rethinking Case Study Research, A Comparative Approach. And today, Professor Vavrus will speak with us about her new, engaging, innovative book, Schooling as Uncertainty, an ethnographic memoir in comparative education. Welcome, Dr. Vavrus.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bartlett, and not only for that generous introduction, but for being such a supportive colleague and friend for the past 21 years. I also want to thank Dr. McCord and Dr. Famakinwa for inviting me today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. There we go. Can everyone see that all right? Yes. Wonderful. Well, this is the first talk that I've given about the book since it was published last month, and it's very fitting that it should be at the University of Wisconsin, as you will see in a few moments. My plan for this afternoon is as follows. I'd like to begin by connecting Madison and Mount Kilimanjaro through my own story, talk about the organization of the book, outline some of the key arguments and concepts, and then show how they appear in several of the paired chapters. I'll conclude with a few reflections on this work and then hopefully leave plenty of time for question and answer. I can truly say that I would not be here speaking with you today if it were not for University of Wisconsin Professor Emerita Magdalena Hauner. She was one of the two co-directors of the Fulbright Hays Group Project Abroad in 1990, on which I had an opportunity to participate, and that was for intensive Swahili language and cultural studies. It not only helped me to advance my fledgling study of Swahili, but helped to generate questions about schooling that continue to animate my work today. However, it was not a given that I was going to continue because I was in the lowest level of the Swahili program at the time. We spent our first month in Morogoro at a language school, and yes, that was me in purple, and I guess that's my favorite color because I'm wearing it again today. We concluded the program at the University of Dar es Salaam, and some of you may recognize the man in the far right picture, the late Dr. Kezi Lahabi, who received his master's and doctoral degrees from the then Department of African Languages and Literature at Wisconsin. I had such a positive experience on this program that Dr. Hauner led that I married one of the fellow students on the program, and we returned to Tanzania 2 years later, 2 weeks after getting married, for his doctoral research. By then, I had been accepted into the University of Wisconsin's Department of Curriculum and Instruction with a minor in African studies for my doctoral work, and I deferred for a year so that I could spend this time in Tanzania on something like a do-it-yourself pre-dissertation experience. It was during this second trip to Tanzania, 1992 to 1993, that I finally saw Mount Kilimanjaro and began teaching on the mountain at the school I've called Njema Secondary School in my previous work, and I'll continue to do so. Yet things did not go quite as planned on this second trip to Tanzania, and it is here where the story begins in earnest in the first chapter of the book entitled Marital Misgivings. The book is organized into 6 sections, each of which is comprised of 2 entangled chapters. One focused somewhat more on my experience, and the other weighted toward the research in which I've been engaged in a community on Mount Kilimanjaro called Old Moshi since my doctoral research in 1996. In 2 of the latter chapters, I focus on research and the teacher education program that Dr. Bartlett just mentioned at a college of education not far from Old Moshi. The first section of the book, Shaky Beginnings, describes the challenges that arose during the second trip to Tanzania and how my struggles as a trailing spouse were amplified by my concerns about my competence as an aspiring researcher. This more personal account of shaky beginnings is entangled with the beginning of my role as a teacher at Njema during a period of serious financial and managerial crisis at the school. These 2 chapters invite readers to engage conceptually with the question of what constitutes crisis and for whom, and at what point are people willing to take extreme actions when confronted with a sense of abandonment by those they thought would make their lives more certain. The second section, Precarious Parenthood, also has a strong connection to Madison, and I'm going to discuss these 2 chapters in a few moments. So suffice it to say that Meritor Hospital on Park Street in Madison makes a cameo appearance, because this is where my first son, Gus, was born in April of 1995. And 9 months later, we were back in Kilimanjaro at the beginning of 1996 for my doctoral research. The third section, Fallible Expertise, is a reflection on this year of fieldwork, and it explores deeply held views on child rearing of my Tanzanian neighbors and colleagues and of my own that conflicted with my own, and the different views that we had on discipline and punishment. The 2 entwined chapters in this part of the book recount first how my neighbors responded with alarm at our attempts to discipline Gus by teaching him to sleep in his own bed using the popular in the US method of crying it out, leading me to question my certitude on this practice and of many others. The second of the 2 chapters recounts my initial indignation at the use of corporal punishment at Njema Secondary School, and how my views on teacher-centered instruction and corporal punishment shifted somewhat during this year through ongoing dialogue with my colleagues, and especially with a veteran teacher who helped me to frame pedagogy and punishment within a broader post-colonial, post-socialist perspective. If it were not for the unwavering support of my doctoral committee at Wisconsin, I would not have landed a postdoctoral fellowship and a position as an assistant professor, both of which are discussed in the interlude and bring the story up to the year 2000. The 3 sections in the second half of the book, 2 of which I'll discuss today, draw largely on 2 post-dissertation projects. The first was a 12-year longitudinal study that I began in 2000 with 277 youth at the end of primary school who were living in Old Moshi at the time. One unexpected dimension of this study was the impact of the HIV/AIDS pandemic on their families' lives well into the early 2000s. The second project discussed in the sections entitled Policy Arbitrariness and the Social Life of Uncertainty arose during the 2006-2007 academic year, when my family, which by then included a second child, Oscar, lived in Kilimanjaro at the Teachers College that Dr. Bartlett mentioned. This project was both an ethnography of teacher education in Tanzania and the beginning of a professional development program for Tanzanian secondary school teachers that continues at the college today. The epilogue was written initially in 2018, but revised during the tumultuous summer of 2020 in Minneapolis. It returns to key places and persons discussed throughout the book, and it serves as a reflection on uncertainty in my own life and in the lives of several former colleagues and neighbors as it intensified during the period during which this book was written. By weaving personal experiences into the story of my research and reflecting on how the research experience has shaped my life for 3 decades, I seek to advance 3 interrelated arguments. The first has to do with biography and knowledge production in ethnographic research. There's been a great deal of attention paid since I began my doctoral studies to the writing about or against culture, to voice, tense, positionality, to the ethics of fieldwork, and to the notion of a field itself. I've been influenced by and I've partaken in these discussions, but I've long felt that they do not go quite far enough in positing how the process of forging, expanding, and sometimes pruning relationships produces valuable knowledge. Group or place-based ethnography, such as the sort in which I was engaged as a doctoral student, may incorporate temporal or autoethnographic elements, but the relations themselves between researcher and interlocutors and the paths that led to their formation over a long period of time that often defines ethnographic research have not, in my view, received sufficient attention. Thus, I've drawn on the work of feminist anthropologists, particularly Ruth Behar, and her call to, quote, put vulnerability at the center of ethnographic practice and ethnographic writing. I've also continued to employ the concept of coevalness from Johannes Fabian, whose work I encountered first at Wisconsin, as it addresses the importance of cotemporality as a condition, a possible condition for dialectical confrontations between people. And I remain steadfast in my belief that relational ethnography, such as that promoted by Matthew Desmond, enables the study of meaning making as a process that emerges over time. As I write in my book's introduction, I have returned repeatedly to Kilimanjaro to advance a different approach to knowledge production that unfolds over an extended period of time, acknowledges the researcher's role in producing such knowledge, and reflects on how she herself has been affected by the experience. From this perspective, the inescapable dilemmas of everyday life that confront researchers who participate in the communities they are studying serve to enrich social research because these dilemmas generate a productive sort of friction as they rub up against existing social theory. The longer I teach, the more I see this interplay as a potential source of knowledge to benefit the next generation of scholars. I now consider the separation of spheres to be a lost intellectual opportunity because the two are so often inextricably connected. The second and third arguments could be considered instantiations of the first, in that they both address the central phenomenon in the book, uncertainty, and its amplification and mitigation in the interconnected social worlds, both interpersonal and international worlds. It was through the process of rereading the material upon which this book is based, a process I began 5 years ago, that I found myself coming back to the question of why Tanzanian youth, the group with whom I've worked most extensively, strive to stay in school despite the odds against them in moving to the next stage of the educational system or finding employment commensurate with their credentials. I sat for months with Post-it notes and a whiteboard in my office, identifying themes and phrases that appeared repeatedly in my field notes, interview transcripts, household surveys, journal entries, and especially in the many letters I wrote to my parents beginning in 1990 that my mother kept neatly filed in binders. As I reflected on the worlds of young Tanzanians who did and did not make it to secondary school, I also heard echoes of the rationale I provided to my parents as to why I was pursuing a doctoral degree and then a tenured faculty position. We were all trying to make our lives more certain through education. The Swahili phrase, kuhakikisha maisha, to make life certain, had been there all along in the youth's words and in mine, yet I had not paid sufficient attention to it until years later, in 2016, when I had a sabbatical and began writing this book. Yet schooling in their lives and mine did not always generate the kind of stability and security we were seeking. I became much more curious in tracing the ways that despite the precarity in most of these youths' lives, they still carried on. A few ethnographies came out around the same time that took up the theme of uncertainty. And I was particularly struck by the words of Sandra Calkins and her 2016 book entitled Who Knows Tomorrow? Uncertainty in Northeastern Sudan. In it, she captures the twofold nature of uncertainty that I've sought to employ in this book. Namely, I quote her here, the limited ability to predict even the immediate future, and uncertainty as a type of anticipatory knowledge production. I further elucidate this position by drawing on the work of Lauren Berlant and her concept of crisis ordinariness as a way to bring these two dimensions of uncertainty together, because precarity is most often felt during periods we define for ourselves as crisis. Berlant states, crisis is not exceptional to history or consciousness, but a process embedded in the ordinary that unfolds in stories about navigating what's overwhelming. The extraordinary always turns out to be an amplification of something in the works, a labile boundary at best, not a slam door departure. In the impasse induced by crisis, being treads water. Mainly, it does not drown. I look at this further in part 4 on AIDS and the ordinariness of crisis, about which I'll speak in a few minutes, where I argue that AIDS is part of a much wider landscape of uncertainty formed by the stratification of social, economic, and biomedical crises. And despite this position of precarity, most families have found ways to stay afloat. The third argument also draws on this dual sense of uncertainty and is directed specifically towards schooling. My view runs counter to the dominant narrative, which suggests that schooling is the primary way by which we can mitigate and even eliminate uncertainty in our lives. Now, I do not dispute the data showing that people with higher levels of education are typically healthier, more satisfied with their lives, and have more secure employment over the course of their lives in Tanzania, the United States, and elsewhere. Yet this effort to make life more certain through schooling is repeatedly foiled for many people, owing to economic, political, and social forces that limit their odds of having a stable life. Borrowing again from Berlant, I employ her term cruel optimism to describe those situations when clinging tightly to our optimistic goals and aspirations can become what she calls an obstacle to our flourishing. I contend that the widespread attachment to schooling in Tanzania as the primary means of securing a good life is an example of cruel optimism, in that completing college, or in many cases primary school, is a virtual impossibility due to structural forces that prevent poor families from paying the requisite fees and foregoing their children's labor. Under these circumstances, the longing for ever more schooling can become an impediment to young people's well-being because they hook their hopes for the future on a possibility they are highly unlikely to realize. Yet some youth are able to flourish nonetheless, and in some cases, the odds are distinctly stacked against them. My analysis of the processes by which this happened shows very clearly that their success in schooling and employment beyond was contingent upon the social relationships they forged with family members, teachers, and sometimes strangers who became wafadhili, sponsors of their education. I will illustrate this in discussing part 6, particularly the final chapter in the book that traces the lives of 4 youth in the longitudinal study. I would now like to move to 3 brief illustrations of these arguments and concepts by looking at parts 2, 4, and 6 in the book. Part 2 forms a bridge between Madison and Moshi by virtue of childbirth and child death. Throughout the book, particularly in this part, I've included quotes from a series of lectures that John Dewey gave in 1929, collectively entitled The Quest for Certainty, which I discuss in the introduction. His admonition that we cannot theorize uncertainty away was strikingly clear in the story of my son Gus's birth in Madison that I recount in chapter 3. Like many graduate student mothers, I read everything I could about childbirth, attended childbirth classes, I exercised, I monitored my diet, and I opted to work with midwives so that I could have a natural childbirth with no epidural, no episiotomy, and certainly not a C-section. Yet none of this came to pass. After 2 days of active labor, Gus was in distress with a failing heart rate, and an emergency C-section saved his life and probably also mine. This failed attempt to tame chance in childbirth was still on my mind 9 months later when we arrived in Old Moshi so that I could spend the year conducting an ethnography of schooling to explore how secondary education might influence young women's views on family formation and desired number of children. Within weeks, it was clear that Gus's presence was helping me to deepen relationships with people I had met in 1993. And he also helped me to forge new connections, especially with mothers, thereby changing my focus slightly from the school and its curriculum to the process by which female students develop their identity as educated women who wanted to make their lives more certain by having far fewer children than their mothers had. Being a new mother also created a co-temporal moment with women in the community who had had difficult childbirths, as I describe in one case in chapter 4. And it led me to become far more attentive to the lives of children and to the suffering of parents than I had been 3 years earlier. The chapter concludes with the story of the death of a newborn, the child of one of my fellow teachers at Njema, who despite his bachelor's degree could not get the medical treatment his daughter needed. The concern I felt for Mr. Kabwe and his wife upon the loss of their child was arguably more acute owing to the intense empathy generated by sharing the same intersubjective space as the parents of young children. As I reflected on this incident in rereading this letter to my family, it reinforced my view that co-temporality and shared meaning making and the shared meaning making it affords are often the foundation upon which relational knowledge is built. Following the second section based on my year of field work and the interlude, part 4 draws on 5 trips to Tanzania between the years 2000 and 2004, during which time my Tanzanian colleagues and I launched the longitudinal study and held meetings in Old Moshi to discuss the findings. I also led a short-term study abroad trip to Tanzania with students from Teachers College at Columbia University. And my family and I spent the summer of 2004 in Old Moshi, living along with a young woman I call Amina in the book, whom we got to know very well in 1996, who has worked with me on a number of studies, including this one in 2004 that I'll describe, and has become one of my closest friends. This table shows the different sources of material that form the basis of this section of the book. I did not set out to study AIDS when I began my doctoral research, but I gradually became aware of the growing health crisis in the Kilimanjaro region. During interviews in 1996, students would occasionally mention that disease. And once or twice, a neighbor in Old Moshi confided that someone had died of ukimwi, AIDS, knowing the cause of death would be identified as a less stigmatizing disease. Over time, the impact of AIDS on life in Old Moshi, and especially on opportunities for schooling, became more evident to me. The death of Amina's mother in 1999 and its effects on her studies clued me into the ways that the loss of a family member might lead to the termination of formal education. My observation of and participation in Amina's life helped me to understand that AIDS is rarely the only misfortune faced by many Tanzanian families. It is, in fact, one crisis among many, especially for young people whose economic circumstances are already highly precarious. I attempt to show in this part of the book that these aggregated crises belie the view that success in school depends mainly on learning the prescribed curriculum and developing certain dispositions in Tanzania or elsewhere. Many bright students cannot get into secondary school in the first place, or cannot stay there until the national examinations because the person paying for their education has become ill or passed away. Without other social contingencies, neither intelligence nor grit alone proved sufficient for these young people to succeed in school. Rather than treating AIDS and schooling as two distinct domains, I illustrate in the book how their conjuncture intensifies extant conditions of uncertainty. Despite the terrible pain of losing a loved one to the disease, AIDS is not the only source of anguish and anxiety afflicting poor and middle income families. Likewise, failing the national exam or losing one's school sponsor is often one more difficulty among many that Tanzanian youth face. I argue that AIDS can better be understood in terms of Berland's concept of crisis ordinariness. Chapter 7 shares excerpts from essays from a mail-in survey I sent to former students at Njema Secondary School, as well as focus group discussions with some of them. They illustrate the ways that the crisis of AIDS is only one among many they have faced. And, to paraphrase Berlant, in the impasse induced by AIDS, these young people have tread water. Mainly, they did not drown. Chapter 8 employs the concept of crisis ordinariness in exploring the lives of a group of grandparents who were caring for some of the youth in the longitudinal study. Some of them were doing better than expected in school, but most were doing much worse in terms of matriculation to secondary school. Amina helped me with the interviews with grandparents in the summer of 2004. And a great deal of learning also came from observing Gus and Oscar making friends with other kids in the area. Some of the stories of these grandparents point to the limitations of the concept of crisis ordinariness, because they were, in fact, very near the point of going under due to the demands of caring for grandchildren when their own adult children were ill or had died. At the core of the chapter is the story of Gus and Heike, who became friends during the time we were there. Her strong skills in English in a country where primary school students rarely speak the language surprised me, especially because she appeared to be malnourished and from a very poor family. As I wrote in my journal, for some time I've been wondering about the family of the very small 14-year-old girl who has befriended Gus. I finally learned about Heike's situation during an interview with her grandparents. Her grandfather told Amina and me that Heike is one of 9 young children who live with him, a 72-year-old man and his wife who's suffering from breast cancer. There are 3 other adults in the household too, including the wife of his son who was an engineer who died of AIDS. This then explains the more prosperous days that Heike's family may have had when she started school. The imbrication of AIDS with other difficulties of everyday life created a particularly problematic situation for some grandparents. But this does not mean that they were passive in the face of the challenges that had befallen them. This was the case for Heike's grandparents, who were finding it very difficult to cope with the care of a number of grandchildren and needed a path toward a solution. During the final week of our stay in 2004, we expected Heike to come and say goodbye. Gus had told her we were departing, and he had a book selected for her as a going away gift. Yet Heike did not appear. Finally, I asked our host about it, and she told me the story she had heard from a neighbor. It seemed that a distant aunt had come to take Heike to live with her, promising Heike's grandparents that she would receive better care under their roof. Mungu akipenda, our host said with a heavy sigh, God willing. She and I both knew that the odds of Heike receiving good care and returning to school were slim. Yet it was also clear that Heike's grandparents could barely cope with the care of young and ailing members of the household. It was a problematic situation, a crisis of care intensified by AIDS, but not defined by the disease alone. The final pair of chapters in the book builds on the previous ones in various ways, but in the interest of time, I'm going to focus solely on chapter 12, gendered contingencies, as it best exemplifies the third argument in the book about the cruel optimism of schooling and the social relationships often necessary for advancement. Throughout the book, I argue that social contingencies greatly affect how one navigates uncertainty, especially the uncertainty surrounding post-primary schooling. And I show that the formation of social networks is a critical part of youth's efforts to make life certain. Yet the lives of the nearly 300 youth in the longitudinal study also revealed the contingent nature of the very terrain upon which they sought to forge these critical social relationships. It is not a solid, steady playing field, but rather one traversed unevenly by class, geography, and especially gender. In chapter 12, I highlight 4 of these stories: 2 women's stories, Grace's and Farah's, and 2 men's, Jackson's and Baraka's. I chose them because they were particularly poignant illustrations of the different structured patterns of possibility for making life more certain through schooling, with cognitive and non-cognitive skills like determination and grit that we hear a great deal about today, forming only one part of a more complex picture. The chapter begins with the story of Grace, who was holding her newborn son when Amina and I visited her in 2012 for the final round of interviews in the longitudinal study. Despite Grace's joy, she had not intended for her life to unfold in this way. Among the 146 young women in the longitudinal study, Grace seemed like the most likely to fulfill her aspirations of getting a master's degree at the University of Dar es Salaam, the country's flagship institution, and becoming a journalist. In Standard 7, the final year of primary school, she was ranked second in her class of 129 students. In addition, Grace's family matched the local profile of those whose children tended to complete higher education. Her mother had finished college and her father had a teaching diploma. There were only 3 children in the household compared to the average of 4 or 5, and her family always had enough food to eat. Furthermore, Grace's father, who had been interviewed periodically over the 12 years of the study, supported Grace's choice of journalism as a career and expected her to attend university, the same expectations he had for her 2 younger sisters. In 2007, Grace was well on her way to becoming a journalist. When we met at that time, she had recently completed Form 6, which is the final year of secondary schooling, at a very good government school and was awaiting her results. Her tone was determined and her goals were clear whenever she spoke about the future. And I quote her here: "I want to be an independent woman. I saw my mother being a homemaker for a long time until she recently found a job. I don't want to live such a life, to depend on a man. I also want to help my community." And I asked her, "Why don't you want to depend on a man?" She replied, "You won't have a happy, full life. When you need clothes or bus fare, he has to provide it for you. And I don't think that's a good life. I want to show others that women are able to govern their lives. That's why I'm studying hard." Yet it was obvious on this day in 2012 that Grace had not become a journalist. And I hesitated before asking her why she had not followed this path she had set for herself in 2000 and reasserted in our interview in 2007. I posed the question as delicately as I could. And as soon as I mentioned journalism, Grace added that she really wanted to study it. Her voice quivered as she began to explain, quote, "After completing Form 6, I still wanted to do journalism. That was my dream, I told you. If I had been able to join university, I would have studied mass communication and journalism, but I was not able to do so. At that time, there were financial problems at home, so I was unable to continue. I could have gone to university because I passed Form 6, but I was not able to go because of the financial situation with my younger sisters in secondary school who needed their fees paid. This situation forced me to go for the crash program. This is the crash teaching program that was starting in Tanzania at that time, where teachers were trained for 1 month. Although I initially did not want to become a teacher because of my fear of standing in front of students. I went there by force because of the prevailing circumstances in my family. It's not something I wished for or wanted. I would rather not talk about it. If I were studying journalism, I would," and her voice trailed off. Both Grace and Faraha passed the primary school leaving exam and were selected to attend government secondary schools, but only one, Grace, did so, and neither one went to university. The 2 young men had a different experience. Jackson passed the primary school leaving exam, but Baraka did not. Jackson had interrupted schooling due to difficulties in finding sponsors to pay for his schooling, but he eventually completed a bachelor's degree in education at a small university. Baraka, who had not passed the primary school leaving exam, needed to find someone to pay for his schooling at a private secondary school, which he finally did. And in the end, he was the only youth in the longitudinal study to complete a bachelor's degree at the University of Dar es Salaam by the end of 2012, the end of the study. Despite this uncertainty, none of these youth sat idly by and simply waited for life to happen to them. They made adjustments to the present at critical junctures in their young lives that meant for Grace and Faraha relinquishing their optimism about the future as they had envisioned it in 2000 and 2007, and establishing different goals that reflected this recalibration. Grace, for instance, concluded our interview by saying the following: "No, my earlier objective was not achieved, but I don't regret it that much. I have to adapt to the way things are, even though earlier I was deeply hurt by this situation. I thank God very much because by going to a teacher's college, I've realized there are children with special needs for me to help." And Grace is now a special ed teacher. This recalibration of aspirations may be the primary way in which we adjust to schooling as uncertainty. Despite academic success, we still may not be able to persist in school. Work as hard as we may, it may still not be enough to succeed. And yet, most of us keep at it, recalibrating, re-envisioning, and rethinking the social contingencies that might help us make our lives just a little bit more certain. During the 5 years that I've worked on this book, I've had many moments for reflection, particularly when students have asked me what I would do differently if I were starting my academic journey anew. It seemed like a fitting way to end this talk at Wisconsin because this is where I did my doctoral studies. So I thought I would share 3 of those reflections with you. First, I would seek to be far more attuned to the racial politics of knowledge production and dissemination. When I began my doctoral studies, gender was in the spotlight in my areas of study, and I paid far more attention to it than other salient aspects of identity in my research and in considering my own positionality. We can become narrowly focused on one aspect of the social world and fail to see how it articulates with others. Second, I would employ more processual methods and strive to be more critical and conscious of the boundedness of persons and places that can creep into ethnographic research despite our best efforts against it. For instance, even though this book is comprised of multiple studies that extend far beyond one school in one community on Mount Kilimanjaro, I may still be telling a single story of the chaga in Kilimanjaro. If I were starting over, I would focus more on the processes by which gender, ethnicity, and other identities become salient through schooling. Finally, I would want to remain critical of what Dewey calls spectator theory and what W.E.B. Du Bois calls car window sociology, because I believe there's a great deal to be learned through messy engagement in the daily lives of those with whom we live and work during fieldwork. Yet I would also hope that from the moment a question worthy of research emerges, I would ask myself whether I would be welcome to pose such a question of others. Whose interests might the question and answers serve? And what harm might I be inflicting in pursuit of this line of inquiry? These are difficult questions, especially for those beginning their first research project. I believe they can best be explored with others in the relationships we forge over time, and by granting ourselves a bit of grace as we grow and learn in the process. Thank you. I hope we can have some question discussion, and I will stop sharing my screen now.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Vavrus. That was wonderful. I want to start us off and encourage all of you to use the Q&A to add any questions you have. So in the book, Fran, you make an argument about the relationship between personal experience and relationships to knowledge production. And I wonder how you would use that argument to help us think about ethical engagement in international research.
That's a very, very important point. So the chapter that I did not have time to discuss in the final part of the book, called Speed Bumps on Lima Road, she tries to address that. It's about the experiences of working with international development organizations and also presenting some of my research to those organizations in 2007 and onward. And one of the challenges that I think exists in the field of international development is that role and the set of responsibilities that we have as outsiders working in communities with which we may or may not be particularly familiar. And also in that chapter, I try to reflect on my experience of working with this teachers college for a number of years. Also, having lived in this region for some time and working there over the span of 25 or so years, and still not fully understanding many of the dimensions of social life that are important to those in the community. So, for example, the chapter title comes from this road that we would take from the college to the school where my sons were attending. And one day I drove by and I thought that the team of workers were filling in potholes, which to me was like the main problem. And I learned over the course of a couple of days, they were actually building speed bumps to try and slow traffic in an area which I did not think would ever need such an alteration. And I began thinking about how my initial reaction that this must have been an international development organization funding speed bumps where they weren't needed, forcing people to do this development project, reflected my skepticism about international development work, even while I have engaged in some of that. But through discussions with folks in the community, I realized that the speed bumps made a lot of sense to those who hope to see that area develop further, have homes built, businesses, and so forth. And so I think I would have missed out on an understanding of speed bumps as symbolic of other matters if I had not had that opportunity to engage in discussion about that. So that's one example, I guess I would say, of the opportunities for discussion, engagement with others that is possible when one works in the same place over an extended period of time. So that would be one answer to that question. And I think if the book does anything, I hope, it is to suggest ways that researchers at different points in their careers, from early stage doctoral students on to full professors, might think more deeply about how we could examine processes of relationship formation as the subject of scholarship. So it's not only the people, it's not only the place, but how is it that we come to learn what we think we know about other persons and places by way of kind of dialogical encounter with others.
Thank you. So Dr. Cohen says, thank you for the presentation and has enjoyed reading the book, and asks, what inspired you to write this book? And how did you build the courage to share these stories, many of which are very personal, and the vulnerability that they open?
Thank you. So I began parts of this book in 2007, as some of you who are attending may know, because at that point I was still at Teachers College and I was on a sabbatical at that point. And the final 6 weeks or 2 months of that sabbatical were a little bit disappointing to me professionally, in that I realized that the writing that I'd hoped to do about the longitudinal study, so it was like halfway, 2006, 2007, the writing about that was not going to happen. I was still in the midst of, gathering data and so forth. So I stepped back and decided to write some essays about that year. It was a book it was going to be a book called The Sabbatical Year, and talking about each month during this year as a kind of a meaning-making episode. And then I returned to the US. There was a lot of work, a move, et cetera, and I never returned to it. So in some ways, I began writing this book during a period when I was living in Tanzania, and had a chance to think about more creative ways of expressing the learning that I felt was taking place. So when the second opportunity to write arose, another sabbatical in 2016, I decided that writing a book based solely on the data from the longitudinal study was not of interest to me any longer. And that what remained of interest were questions that students especially continued to ask me about: how did you do what you did? That sort of implied that I knew in advance what was going to unfold in my life, or that I had the answers before I even asked the questions, or that I was able to balance having children and being a researcher in a way that made it seem very easy. And none of that was accurate. So I began looking for materials that might explain how we bring our lives in, our personal lives together with our research. And there are a number of very interesting accounts, but I didn't find anything that did exactly what I wanted to do, looking at a longer span of time and how those research experiences profoundly affected the, the researcher, myself, as well as the other way around. So by 2016, I was a full professor, and one of the privileges of that, and it's a huge privilege, is not to have to go through a review again. So I decided, to quote another, I decided to write what I like. And so that was really the incentive for doing this. Now, the issue of vulnerability was very difficult, as there are some painful moments that are recounted in the book. Someone asked me recently about moments that made me cringe when I was rereading my letters and journal entries, and there were many of those. But I felt that if I didn't include those, if I didn't show what I was thinking and what my beliefs and attitudes were from 30 years ago, I was perpetuating the idea that I was, sort of this fully formed, enlightened person who is yet to develop, but I knew more than I did at the time. And I think if this work is going to be useful for doctoral students and others earlier on in their careers, I want them to see that I too, fumbled a lot. I had assumptions that now make me very uncomfortable. And so writing with that kind of vulnerability, I felt was maybe a debt I owed to the next generation.
Thank you. So we have a question from Teresa Speciale. She asks, how has race shaped access, relationality, analysis, representation, and dissemination of your work?
Yeah, excellent question. As I pointed out at the end of the presentation, I look back on my research and realize how almost singularly focused I was on gender. When I began my developing the topic for my dissertation, the International Conference on Population and Development was underway. So that was like 1994. And there was so much in the world of international development and demography and internet and comparative education about girls schooling, and get girls into school and all kinds of social change will come about. And so having just taught in Tanzania for that previous period and wondering, well, how is schooling transformational for girls? That became the anchor for my work for a long time. And in a sense, it put certain blinders on what I focused on in my research. So I think that in terms of the focus on race, it was far more absent than it might have been if I were starting my research today. That said, racial politics are very different in Tanzania than in the United States. And so I can't say that it was always as salient in Tanzania as it might be in the United States, and certainly at this moment in the United States. But race absolutely affected access. It affected all kinds of privileged positions that I believe I had. For example, prior to becoming a faculty member, which opened many doors, being a white doctoral student, I think, allowed me to access certain officials who might not have been willing to speak with me otherwise. I can only hypothesize about that, but looking back on it, I imagine that might have been one of the reasons why they were willing to speak about it. I was from a distinguished university, the University of Wisconsin, well known in Tanzania, and so there were these privileges associated with it. As far as dissemination, I've tried to disseminate work whenever possible in Tanzania. People have been very generous about that. I've worked with colleagues on publications that they have disseminated. But I remain attuned to the fact that during the period in which I was working toward tenure to make my life more certain, there were certain journals that were more privileged than others. And those were the ones that I either was encouraged to publish in or felt I ought to publish in them. And not one of them was based in Africa. So there are these continuing kind of colonial legacies of knowledge dissemination that have made it problematic, and in my view, when it comes to sharing the results of research and meeting the expectations of tenure committees that highly value what they may call an international journal. And yet that's really code for a journal often published in the global north. A journal published in Tanzania from the perspective of someone sitting in the United States is very much an international journal, but it doesn't come with the same status in the, or, impact factor that other journals might. And that matters when someone is going up for tenure at many institutions.
Great, thank you. So Professor Claire Wendland said, I find your point on the harms asking a research question can do an interesting one, and perhaps especially for a project that suggests that schooling isn't all it's cracked up to be. You mentioned that these questions, you mentioned that these are questions we should be asking with others. Do you have additional thoughts on how to approach this problem, given that some harms are difficult to anticipate?
Such a good question. When I was a doctoral student, we read a lot about feminist ethnography, and can there be feminist ethnography, and can we do research that we are confident will do no harm? And I would say overall the answer was no. We can't always anticipate the pain that questions might inflict, or even the difficulties that may result from participation in a project. When people sign a consent form or give oral consent, they may not fully understand what it is that you plan to do with their words and actions. And so that's certainly a very sensitive issue. What I've tried to do over the years, and I owe a huge debt to certain friends and colleagues in Tanzania, is share research questions, share the household survey that was developed with them, and get their views on everything from, is this an appropriate set of questions to ask, to, is this the best way to ask that question? So I have had a number of moments where a very trusted friend and colleague and co-collaborator has said to me, I don't think this is something you should ask about. I think it would be uncomfortable. I think that it's just not something that you should write about even. Amina, for example, in an earlier piece that I wrote based on some work with her, when she read the transcript of the interview upon which I wanted to base this piece, I said, is there anything that you don't want shared with others, even with a pseudonym? And she did. She crossed some things out. She said, I don't want you to share this. So that is one way, I think, to try and mitigate harm, all the while realizing that we may not be aware of the harm that we do. And so it's something that I remain especially cognizant of, and would encourage all of us to think very carefully about when and where we are welcome to ask questions, and who might be able to help us decide whether these are questions not only worth asking from the point of view of our field, but are ethical to ask.
I'm afraid we're out of time, but there are a number of other questions I'll share with you, and want you to know there are lots of congratulations and thanks in the comment stream for your talk and for your book. Thank you so much, Dr. Vavrus, for being with us today, and for this beautiful book that you shared.
Well, thank you so much. And anyone who wishes to continue the conversation, please feel free to send me an email message or WhatsApp, what have you, and we can do so. So thank you again.